Welcome back to another episode of When Life Feels Messy. My name is Erin Raspberry, and I'm one of your wonderful, wonderful hosts.
Hi, Erin.
Hi, Ash.
Other wonderful, wonderful host, Ashley Barrera, and we have a special guest, a special treat this episode.
Yes, Cyndi Grady is back with us for her third time on the podcast.
OMG.
So thankful. We were just talking about this is our first official sequel episode on the pod. For those of you who may or may not have listened to episode 3, Cyndi joined us for the first time to talk about the power and control wheel. She was also on episode 9, so definitely give those a listen. And we are so excited that you're joining us again, Cyndi.
Hi, Erin and Ashley. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm so excited to be back with you today, talking about this really important topic of domestic violence. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I'm one of the staff counselors at TWU on our Denton campus. And I've been with CAPS for almost 2 years. And before that, I spent 15 years working in the field of domestic violence at a local nonprofit. And thanks again for having me back today.
Yes, of course. I'm so excited. You're like the When Life Was Messy Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
I
know.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm really honored. Wow.
We're going to have a plaque just for Cyndi. Well, we want to kick off this episode and give you listeners a little idea of what you're going to be hearing. So last year we did a full kind of spread on October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And Cyndi did a wonderful job of really talking about the power control wheel, how that looks in a relationship, right? Kind of knowing the signs and stuff. But this year we decided to do a different spin on what to do if you have a loved one that's in an abusive relationship. So kind of looking from the outside in. So I'm super excited for Cyndi to kind of talk through that. Because I think that's something we hear a lot is I don't like that this person that I care about is in this relationship, right? And I can tell things are not okay, but also not knowing what to do, right? What's in our limits, what's our responsibility. So Cyndi's going to get all into that today. But without further ado, Ash, what will we start with to kick off this podcast episode?
So like you said, we are bringing awareness to domestic violence awareness, which is October. So let's start off with our first question. What are the signs or indications that someone may be in an abusive relationship?
Okay, yeah. A lot of people really try to hide the fact that they're in an abusive relationship. And so it may be a little bit hard to see some of these signs and indications. And so the fact that you don't see signs or indications doesn't necessarily mean that someone's not in an abusive relationship. But sometimes what we will see will be particularly changes in behavior or changes in the way a person seems to think about themselves. So somebody who used to be very social, used to always be up for going out to happy hour after work, or used to always be up to going to a party, or just enjoyed being around others, may be slowly starting to become more isolated. Maybe they always are turning down those invitations now, making excuses for why they can't attend, why they need to stay home or be with their partner instead. And they might seem afraid of their partner, or they might seem to just feels to you like they have to ask their partner permission for everything they do, or if they spend any money, whereas that wasn't the case before. Maybe everything they do seems to revolve around their partner and what they like or what they want. And it feels to you like this person is kind of losing themselves. Nothing is about what they want to do or what they like anymore, but it's just all about the partner, pleasing the partner, making sure they don't upset the partner, feeling afraid of what might happen if they upset the partner. You just start to see these things. There may be sort of an inability to make decisions, really struggling because they're going through these mental gymnastics of, what's going to cause me the least amount of trouble with my partner.
Right.
There may be excuses for physical injuries. Of course, we know that with abuse, a lot of times there aren't any physical injuries that can be seen by another person. But if you do happen to see bruises, that's probably one of the more common ones that you would see, or scratches, or somebody may be limping, seeming to be sore, things like that. They may have excuses for that, and it may seem like these things are happening frequently, and they've always got an excuse for it, and sometimes the excuses may not really seem to make sense. Another one is somebody who starts saying, I'm sorry all the time, just all the time, constantly, no matter what the situation is.
Right.
They say, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think those are some of the typical indicators that might cause you to just start to feel concerned.
Yeah, I think, that emphasis on like the change, right, and behavior too. And something I think too of, even to clarify, because I feel like a lot of the time when you hear, oh, abusive relationship, you automatically think physical, right? And it's not just that. It is the emotional, the verbal, the mental abuse, which is just as intense, right? And like harmful as like the physical. And so thinking about too of, if your friend or loved one or whoever is like suddenly like not going out, right? Or turning down invitations, or like wants to be at home all the time. It might not be that they're scared their partner's going to like physically abuse them, but their partner could be telling them like all kinds of things, right? Manipulations of like, if you go out with your friends, you don't love me, right? Like you would stay home with me, you wouldn't have a job, you would just stay home and take care of me, X, Y, and Z. So like it's not always just like physical harm, right? Or that aggression, but it can be very manipulative behavior and things said.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Yes, very often it is. I've had a lot of people tell me that, the emotional and mental abuse is absolutely as harmful. They may not have experienced physical abuse, or even if they have, the emotional and mental abuse is just as harmful. And a lot of times that's what they're afraid of. They may not be afraid that they're going to be physically assaulted, but they are just wanting to avoid conflict. They're like, they just make it so difficult for me. They call me constantly. If I go out with my friends, they call and text me constantly throughout the night. Everybody else is hanging out and having a good time, and I'm answering the phone 20 times. And they're bugging me to go home right away. They're bugging me to leave early. They're accusing me of cheating on them. Who are you with? Why do you want to go out with those people? Who are you meeting up with? Like that. And so a lot of times, even family events, not wanting the person to go be around their family. And so, because these are all people, friends and family, maybe people who will give the person who's being abused a different perspective. They may be people who will express concern, and the abuser is going to be worried about that. And so they do try to just manipulate and control and wear down, to where finally the person just says, you know what, it's just not worth the trouble. I just won't go.
Yeah. And I think, I can't remember if we talked about this in episode 3, but this idea of, oh, if my partner is like blowing up my phone, right, when I'm going out, means that they care so much, right? They love me so much. Is so harmful. Like we've like romanticized and like fantasized this idea, and it's like, no, like a healthy relationship is a partner that like trust you to go out, doesn't need your time and attention 100% of the time, right? Isn't like tracking you consistently, watching all the pictures that are posted of you to see who you're with. Like, it's very much not that, but it baffles me of how romanticized it's become.
Yes,
Of
that's so
being.
true. That is so true. And especially I think in social media and in other media too, sometimes movies or TV shows, it's seen as, oh, if this person's really interested in you, then they will chase you, they will pursue
Right.
you.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
thing.
Yeah. So those listening, right? Like if you see that happening to your friend, that is a red flag. A red flag
Yes.
right now.
A really big red flag. The
Really
reddest
big
of red flags.
Yes. Oh man.
When you were
But
listing these, oh, go ahead.
oh no, you go ahead, Ash.
When you were listing these, Cyndi, I literally thought of like the honeymoon phase is like right before you get married, and then after you get married, it's like I see all these like horror stories of like, oh my gosh, now that we're married, we have these different expectations of, oh, now you're a wife, now you're a husband, and now I'm gonna treat you different. And then you're literally married or you have a kid, right? And it makes all these symptoms or signs kind of like less apparent because you're like, this is what it's supposed to be, right? Like, is this how the change is supposed to happen?
Right.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, because so often people will even say that they got married because they thought it meant that the person would, well, if I just go ahead and marry him, surely he'll trust me then. Surely he can't believe that I'm out cheating on him or whatever. He'll quit being so obsessive and possessive once we're married, because he'll know that, I've made that commitment to him. But instead, a lot of times the abuse escalates and gets even worse once they're married, because then the abuser knows, okay, now there's this legal bind between us. And, money is combined and ownership of things is combined. And then you start possibly having children come along, and whether they're married or not, once children get involved, then that opens another avenue for the abuser to exert power and control.
Yeah, it's a valid point. But the good thing about this, right, is that people who are seeing loved ones in these abusive relationships, like there are clear things that they can do, right, in these situations. And so what kind of things would you say, Cyndi, are maybe the do's and don'ts as a loved one that's seeing their person being like in these abusive relationships?
The first thing that I think is really important is to take it seriously. If you see these warning signs, these red flags, do take it seriously, because, domestic violence, whether it's emotional and verbal or physical, sexual, whatever it is, it does happen, and it's very underreported. So even the massive statistics that we have about how many people are abused, we know that that is underreported. So take it seriously and believe the person if they tell you that something is going on that's wrong, that they're being abused in some way. So many times people who try to make an outcry, they may test the waters. They may say something that's a little bit smaller, giving you a tidbit to see how you react to it. Saying something kind of vague, like, oh, I don't think he'd want me to go there. Or he doesn't really like it if I, stay out late because he's worried that something bad will happen to me. Kind of phrasing it as he's worried for my safety rather than he's controlling. And so a lot of times the person will be kind of hesitant when they start to reveal information, because they may be embarrassed or ashamed about what's happening, or they may be concerned about how you'll respond.
Right.
And so they may not just lay it all out clearly at first. And so just believe them and let them know you can come right out and say, I believe you. I'm here for you. If you do hear concerning information, you can say it's not your fault and you don't deserve to be abused.
Mm-hmm.
Just very simple statements like that. And be sure and talk to them at a place and time that they feel safe and confidential. Sometimes it can be hard to get that private time with somebody, but it is important to try to make sure that this information that they've shared with you is not going to get back to their abuser.
Right.
And remember that false reports or accusations are very, very rare, extremely rare. So if somebody does let you know that something's going on that's not right, it is almost certainly true. And it's almost certainly going to be worse than what they're telling you.
Right. Yeah.
They're not blowing it out of proportion or exaggerating it. It's the opposite.
And thinking even too of like how many times like the abusers will, use manipulation tactics to be like, oh, nobody will believe you, right? Like you're not actually being abused, like you're making it up. And so like if, they feel comfortable and safe enough to disclose, even making really vague statements to a loved one, like that could be a big thing of them challenging this like really manipulative narrative they're hearing all the time about like their reality almost.
Yes, exactly. They're wanting to test the waters and see, will this person just confirm what the abuser is saying, or will this person say something different? Will they confirm my suspicion that what's happening to me isn't right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Even like the simple I believe you can be a huge like impact, even if it doesn't like make for immediate change right there in that moment, right? It plants a seed sometime that's needed.
Exactly. And then for more kind of I guess practical support or tangible support, you can offer whatever support you can realistically provide. And it's really important to be specific and practical and realistic about what support you can provide. Sometimes people are well-meaning and they'll say something like, if you ever need anything at all, anytime, day or night, I'm here for you. But then if that person does reach out, then maybe you're not really able to do that. And you said it with the best intentions, but then the person who was abused feels let down. And so it's important to be very realistic and specific. You can ask, how can I help? Or what do you need most? And then if that's not something that you can directly provide, you can say, well, I'm going to try to find some resources. I'm going to find out how I can help you get that. If they say, I need a place to stay, maybe you don't have the capacity to let them come and stay with you for 6 weeks. But you can say, I really want to help you meet that need. So I'm going to find out how to help you. I'll find out what are resources in the area. You can offer to do things that you can realistically do. Maybe that's watching the kids for a couple of hours so they can have a break, so they can use the time to, make some phone calls to, to a domestic violence agency, or to sign up online for SNAP benefits, or whatever it is that they need to do. Just maybe watching the kids for a couple of hours may be so helpful, or taking care of their pets, because so many people hesitate to leave a violent or abusive relationship because they're worried about what will happen to their pets. And so if you can say, you know what, I would be glad to take your dog in, while you get things figured out, or I could take your cat in, or whatever, or, I can help you find someplace where your pets can go safely. Maybe you can pay for some boarding, or you can just find some resources that can help with their pets. Maybe you can offer to keep some belongings safe for them. Part of safety planning, which is also on the list, you can help them make a safety plan or refer them to a domestic violence agency to help them make a safety plan. But one of the things we talk about in safety planning is like making copies of your really important documents, like insurance paperwork, birth certificates, marriage licenses, anything like that, car insurance, have a spare car key, have, a change of clothes, have things where if you have to leave at a moment's notice, they can do that.
Right.
And maybe you are the person where you can say, yeah, I could keep a little bag or a little box of belongings, at my home or at my work or in a closet or something. And that way, that's a way that you can help. Sometimes people can offer financial assistance. Not everybody can offer financial assistance,
Right.
but if you are able to, then that's another way that can be really helpful. You can also just learn what are the resources in your area. You can learn the National Domestic Violence Hotline phone number and website. You can have resources that are local to where the person lives so that you can refer them in those directions. Because a lot of times somebody who's being abused, their mental bandwidth is so reduced, they're so exhausted and worn down that they don't necessarily have what it takes to say, okay, I'm going to go online and I'm going to research and I'm going to find what's out there, and then I'm going to take hours to apply for help, and then all of that. So if you can help streamline that process for them by having a list or helping them make the call or helping them go online, all of those things are ways that you can help that don't cost any money, that can be really, really valuable to the person.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad that you highlighted like knowing the local things in your area to provide for people like this support system, because a lot of the times that's the helpless feeling that you have of like, I really love this person, and at times it feels like I want to help them more than they want to help themselves, and offering realistic things that you could do that's within your capacity to help.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that something we'll get to in a little bit kind of segues into of sometimes we get into this mindset of seeing, someone we love that's being like hurt, whether it's physically, whether it's, mentally, whatever, and you want to just like fix it, right? Like save them kind of thing. And a lot of the times, especially in this kind of realm, it's not something that people on the outside can just quote unquote fix. So like being aware of like resources in the area that you can refer a person to can be that quote unquote, right? Like fixing, rather than like you being the sole person that has to like be Wonder Woman or Superman and come in and save the day.
Exactly. And another thing that I saw a video some years ago about a situation in which a woman who was being abused had a coworker who had expressed concern, but of course the person who was abused would frequently make excuses about where the bruises came from. Oh, I ran into the wall, or whatever it was, bumped my arm, things like that. But the coworker had the idea that on her own, she would make notes on her personal calendar, or she would make notes in a notebook of the day and time and what she saw. Like that this person came to work with a bruise,
Right.
or a black eye, or this or that, or, mentioned something that was abusive. And after a time, later on, when there was a court case going on, that information was very, very helpful.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times there may not be official documentation. The person may not have made any police reports. They may not have sought a protective order. They may not have gone to the hospital for any injuries. And so at some point in the future, if they decide that they do want to get out of the relationship, if they're married, they decide to seek a divorce. If they have kids, they decide to try to get custody of the children. They don't have any documentation to back it up.
Mm-hmm.
And very often that turns into a he said, she said in family court, and that doesn't always go well. And so if you have something like that where you have taken some notes, that may end up being something that's helpful later on. It helps create that timeline that could otherwise be missing. So that's another thing you can do that is just has the potential to be helpful. And also just focusing on observations and behaviors. So the way we say things can be really important too.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of saying something like, I can't believe you let him treat you that way, or I can't believe you put up with that. I would never let somebody treat me that way, or I can't believe you went back. You had left and it looked like you were doing so good and then you went back. I can't believe that. Things like that are not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how is that going to make the person feel?
Right, exactly.
And so they're not, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of times the intention is like they care, right? They love and like they're like frustrated and all the things, but the way that it's coming across or being delivered is not effective.
Right. And so some suggestions for that are to just focus on what you have directly seen or observed, behaviors such as, I noticed that you seemed afraid when they looked at you that way.
Mm-hmm.
Or I heard what they said to you, and that's not okay. It's not okay for them to call you a name like that. Or I noticed that you had some bruises, and I wonder if you're okay.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. And also too, like, makes me think of the impact of just being observant and aware, right? To notice like, ooh, like this person's like energy is off, right? Or they've become more timid over time, or X, Y, and Z. Like sometimes even people noticing and calling that out can be super impactful to be like, oh, like someone cares to see, like something's going on. Like even if that's not something that will make them like fully realize and leave the relationship or X, Y, and Z, like again, it kind of plants that seed of, okay, someone's like validating, like someone's seeing this, even if it's something maybe that the abuser wasn't even looking at it from that point of view or had that mindset. It can be like, oh, you know what I mean? So like that I think that kind of goes with like the power of like just being aware, like, and how helpful that can be. And it doesn't involve this crazy intervention or activity or thing. Like it can be as simple as just noticing what's going on.
Yes, you're just being present and you're showing that you care because you are paying attention, and you're not putting any type of a value judgment on it, or you're not saying, I expect you to do something different because of what I see. You're just saying, this is what I see and I'm concerned.
Yes, exactly. Well, I guess in terms of that, like what, Cyndi, in your opinion, right? Like if you were to give advice, tips to someone who maybe is feeling really frustrated, right? Like that their loved one might be staying in an abusive relationship, even if you've called out stuff, right? Like we said, or like made observations or whatever. And maybe the person is like still making excuses for their partner. What do you kind of like recommend for people that are on the outside looking in on this, and like also of how to be aware of like what's in and outside of their control and responsibility here?
It can be really tough sometimes to draw that line and to know where that is. But one thing we want to do is to remember that the victim or survivor is the expert on their life. They're the ones who's actually living their life. And so they're the ones that are going to experience whatever the benefits or the consequences are of whatever decisions and actions they make.
Right.
I may feel very strongly that I want somebody to leave the partner or do this or do that, file for divorce, file for child custody, all these things.
Mm-hmm.
But I may not know the full story.
Right.
Even if they have disclosed some information to me, they've shared some of their story with me. I am really sure that there's a lot of it that they haven't shared with me. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot that I don't know, and I'm not living their life with
Mm-hmm.
that partner. And so just remember that the person is the expert on their life, and the abuser may have made threats that you're not aware of that might impact this person's decision making. The abuser may have made threats that, if you leave, I'll get custody of the kids and you'll never see them again. And that may not be a realistic threat that they can really carry out, but so often people who are being abused do see their abusers as being very capable.
Mm-hmm.
These things, if he says it, it's going to happen.
Right.
And it's a very real threat. And so there may have been threats to harm or kill them or their children, their family members, anybody who helps them. He may have said, if anybody takes you in, I'll come over there and I'll kill them and you.
Mm-hmm.
They may have made threats against their pets.
Right.
Either to whether it's, and it may not even be killing the pets. More often I hear situations where people are like, he told me he'll get rid of them, like he'll take them to the shelter, or he'll just put them out on the street or something.
Mm-hmm.
That happens a lot. He may have made threats. You'll end up with nothing. I will leave you with nothing. I'll take you to court and I will get all the money and I'll get the house and I'll get the car and I'll get the kids and you'll get nothing. And I'll make sure it happens that way.
Right.
And they may have threatened to reveal intimate info, like pic photos or things like that. And so, we have to be aware that there may be things that the victim or survivor is really reasonably afraid of that we're not aware of. And that's what they're making their decisions based on.
Mm-hmm.
And it may make a lot of time for them to feel confident that they can overcome these barriers.
Right. Yeah. Because again, that manipulation, like, it has been used in a very, like, methodical way that when it gets to a point like this, although from the outside it might be like, no, like they won't get custody of the children, right? X, Y, and Z. It doesn't seem and feel like that when you're in it, because this person, right, like this abuser, like seems like someone who like is powerful, right? Has all the information, like can get their way, X, Y, and Z. And so it's not as easy as black and white as it might look from the outside, which I think is like one of the hardest parts and contributors to the frustration, right? And also too, like a lot of the times, like people may not have had experience in an abusive relationship. And so kind of looking at a loved one that is without that experience, that personal experience, it can be really easy to just like, oh, that would be easy to leave X, Y, and Z. And it's like, no, like it's a lot more complicated and complex than it might seem to you, especially if you don't have that personal experience with it.
Right, exactly. So important to remember that. And as you mentioned earlier, it's really important, like, not to try to overstep our bounds, but just to be there for the extent that we can be.
I'm thinking a lot about like that frustration that comes up when you have that loved one stuck in or feels stuck in a abusive relationship, and like the role of like denial a little bit from like the loved one of like, I'm just gonna deny that you're going through this abusive thing because it's too much for me to like feel helpless and doing anything. Even like that frustration of like seen your loved one in the abusive relationship and they're in denial, but the support system's like, red flags over here, like, hold on.
Right.
And I'm curious, like, from your experience, Cyndi, if you've ever had a client who's dealt with that denial from someone in an abusive relationship and like what they could do with that.
Yes, certainly. If I understand the question right, and correct me if I'm wrong, if sometimes the support system or supposed support system can also be in denial.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the person may have disclosed some abuse, or somebody else may have gone to the support system and said, hey, I'm really worried about your daughter because I've seen this or I've heard this.
Yeah.
And then the support system themselves may be in denial because they're like,
Yeah.
but he's such a great guy, because
Exactly. Or he makes all the money.
right. Yeah. It's like that person has never seen that side of him, or them, and has a hard time, kind of putting that in their mind, holding both things, that there's the person I know.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then there's the person that I'm being told is
Mm-hmm.
being abusive, and I can't correlate that with the friend that I know who I've never seen that of, or with my son who I've never, I can't imagine that my son would be an abuser.
Right.
She must be doing something.
Mm-hmm.
He must be doing something to bring it on, because certainly my son would never do that.
Oh,
Right.
That.
Yeah. Oh, that tapped into a whole other
yeah.
other level of things, and even makes me think of, and we don't have to go down this because this is a tangent that could take forever, but like the impact of generational trauma and dynamics and how that shows up, because if your support system, your family or whoever, right, like they experienced that, or they were raised watching that dynamic in their parents, they might think that's a norm, right?
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
So that can play a huge factor in support system, right? Like being in denial or even making excuses for that behavior because that was their norm. And also I think ties into like how complex this whole thing can get because of different dynamics and individual people's trauma experiences and all the things, right? Like what's the narrative that they believe about X, Y, and Z. So it's not simple in any way, shape, or form. And let's just throw that out the window. It's not simple.
Exactly. And then sometimes the victim or survivor may have gone to even sort of institutional things that they feel like should be supportive and helpful, such as church leaders or, housing programs or banks or things like that, where you would hope that you could get some help and support, and they've been denied help, and perhaps even these stereotypes and patriarchal things have been just reinforced rather than providing help.
Right. Yeah. Yep. I think there's a lot of layers to it. We could be on here for 8 hours plus.
Well, plenty more sequels for us to have.
Yes, plenty more sequels. Stay tuned. But I guess like we kind of tapped into this, but maybe like to pivot, Cyndi, is maybe going into like, now that we've established it's not simple, right? Like what are the don'ts for loved ones that are seeing, like people that they care about being in these relationships? What are the don'ts that we need to avoid?
Okay. Yes. And as I alluded to a little bit earlier, don't make statements that might be felt as blaming to the victim or survivor, such as, why don't you just leave? Why do you stay? Why did you go back? I would never let somebody do that to me. Or what did you do to make him so mad or make him do that to you?
Yeah, gross. Ugh.
Yeah, all of those are not going to help, and they're
Right.
just going to serve to like shut off the person from you. They're going to decide that, oh, you are not a safe person, you are not somebody that they can further disclose information to or ask for help.
Right.
And so they're going to become more isolated. Your connection with them is going to be weaker if you make those blaming kind of statements. And another one is, don't attempt to rescue them or force or coerce them into leaving or taking other action that you believe they should take. Sometimes we hear about these things where somebody will just like show up at the person's house and be like, I'm just going to show up and I'm going to get her and I'm going to drag her out and
Right.
grab some of her stuff and we're going to take her out and either take her home with us or take her to a shelter or whatever. We're going to get her out of that situation. And that's not helpful either.
No.
Right. Yeah. No, I think kind of reminds me of us as therapists, right? Like, it is not our job to rescue, right, or fix, or even we have clients that come in and tell us about like being in abusive relationships, or you can just like hear dynamics that are not healthy, right? Like, it's not our job to rescue them or force or coerce them into doing things. It's about the process of empowering them to make these changes and do things for them.
Exactly, right. Because the abuser has spent all their time tearing down this person and making them feel like they can't make good decisions. They can't do anything right. They don't have any power. The abuser has put these messages in them and taken away their power over their own life. And so if we swoop in and try to rescue them and tell them what they should do and make them do it our way, that's just kind of continuing that.
Yeah.
Saying, I don't trust you to make up your own mind. I don't trust you to know what's best for yourself.
Exactly.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
That is such an important thing to highlight. When there's individuals in that abusive relationship, our brains and physical self are hyper vigilant to those patterns of this person has an authority over me, or I have a lack of power in a dynamic and I don't trust, right? Or I'm hyper vigilant to the signs. And that's how we fall back into another abusive relationship, or we go back to the same point. And unfortunately, there's some systems in our society that operate that way.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother podcast.
Exactly.
That's another sequel.
Yeah.
That's right. But we do want people to feel empowered. And so it's just so important to let them know they have the support and the information they need so that they can then do what's best in their estimation, what they decide is best for themselves.
Yes.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Another don't avoid bringing up your concern out of fear of saying the wrong thing or insulting them or a belief that it's not your business. Sometimes we're afraid. We're like, gee, I'm really worried about so-and-so and I'd like to say something, but what if I'm wrong? What if she's not being abused and she gets mad at me for asking? Or what if I say the wrong thing, it comes out wrong and she gets offended? Or maybe it's just not my business. That's her family and that's her business. And I don't need to poke my nose in where it doesn't go. And sometimes we have these thoughts, but if we approach somebody with sensitivity and support, if we phrase things in the supportive way rather than the blaming way, and if we focus on behaviors like what I have noticed, what I have observed, I'm concerned. Is everything okay? Is there anything I can do to help? Most people won't be offended, even if you're wrong or they're not ready to admit that you're right. Either way, they're just going to be thankful that you care And they're going to put that away. That's like planting one of those seeds you've been talking about, Erin. That they'll remember that you are a safe person.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like opening that little window, right, of like opportunity for in the future, right? Like having that space to maybe start making those vague comments, right? Or like even something that I think about or hear a lot is when you have like friends or loved ones that ask those questions and you're like, that was a weird question to ask. Like, oh, like, does your partner ever do X, Y, and Z? And it's like, no, but I'm curious why you're at, you know what I mean? It's like, it opens the window for like that continued, hopefully, right? Like conversations and disclosure of what's happening. And also like thinking too of it, I think it affirms again of this idea of like you're being observant, right? Like you care about them, you're listening to what they're saying or what they're telling you, you're watching things, and it adds to that feeling of support and care, right? Even if they don't know what to do with it at the time, it still like adds to that cup a little bit in the back of their mind. So
right. Yeah. You're making a deposit instead of a withdrawal in their trust of you.
Yes, exactly. And maybe that's the takeaway, right? Of like we want to make deposits, not make withdrawals by being like really aggressive or like forceful or trying to make them do X, Y, and Z or blame, but like add nice deposits of support.
Exactly. Yeah.
Love that.
And then another doubt, which is maybe a little bit difficult to phrase or to understand, but it's once again, just like you don't want to rush over to their person's house and drag the person out, you also don't want to rush over and just be like, well, I'm going to take my baseball bat and go over there and teach him a lesson, or I'm going to tell him what a jerk he's being and yada yada, because guess what? He's going to become really, really angry. And probably the result of that is going to be abuse against the victim, because he's going to assume, well, you would only know to come talk to him that way if she had said something to you about it.
Yes.
And so don't think that you're going to be, once again, the hero by going over, because if you go over and you give him an earful about how bad he is and how wrong he is, do you think that's going to change his mind?
Right. Exactly.
Is that going to make him decide to behave better? Probably not.
No.
Yeah. And the same with like social media postings, this vague posting of posting something that is sort of intended as a message for that person to see, targeted to them, although no name is used or anything like that. But that, if he sees this, he'll know it's that I'm talking about him with this meme I'm posting or whatever. These things can really cause retaliation. They can cause retaliation against the victim, and they can also lead to further isolation, because of course, after that, he's going to make sure that that person doesn't have any chance to have contact with you again. Right. And so you've really lost your chance to be of effective help in that situation. So we want to focus on helping the victim or survivor as opposed to focusing on punishing the abuser. If that punishment happens in the correct way down the line, in the court system or whatever, then fine, but that's not your role. Sometimes people, if it's like your best friend or your brother and you're really close to them or something, sometimes people can say things to an abuser in a kind and concerned way, similar to how you can say something to the victim or survivor, but you have to have the right relationship with the abuser, and you still have to approach them from, I've seen this and I'm concerned. I've noticed that and I'm concerned. Maybe you're at a family gathering and you can tell the tension's building, and maybe he looks at her a certain way, or he, grabs her a certain way or says something to her, and you want to kind of defuse it. Maybe you can go up to him and be, hey, buddy, why don't you come out here and let's go outside and hang around for a little while, and just kind of draw him away to try to distract him and cool him down. And you can express anything like, hey, I saw you talk to her that way, and man, that's not cool, something like that, a buddy to buddy type of thing, where it's not taken so offensively and not so likely to result in further harm. Or if you are wanting to distract the victim or survivor in that situation and be like, oh, let me, hey, I just redecorated this room, come with me over here and let me show you, or something like that, whatever it may be, to try to somehow in that situation put some distance between the two of them. And maybe that then gives you the opportunity, you're in private in the other room away from the abuser, that you can make these observation type of statements. Of course, you can call 911 if there's immediate danger, if there's an immediate threat. Somebody may be harmed immediately, but also realize that sometimes police involvement can lead to greater danger, particularly if it's a community where there are problems with the interactions with the police, or if the abuser may just get really even more angry and retaliate against their victim after the police have left. If nobody gets arrested and the police leave, very often that leads to an immediate retaliatory abuse.
Right. Yeah. Which I think we see a lot play out. And
yes,
it's like, I think everyone's thing is get the police involved, and it's a lot of the times there's not substantial evidence, or that person will get released the same day, and it's the impact of that is way more deadly sometimes than a lot of people think when they're trying to be supportive and help, and so it gets sticky for sure.
Exactly. So that's I guess the point of all of this is that there's very few hard and fast. It's black and white. This is exactly what you should do and exactly what you should not do, because each situation is different and can be fluid and changing.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Much like a lot of things in life, right? Because we're all unique humans with different relationships.
Oh, yeah.
But I guess in terms of that too, for our topic of people who are on the outside, right? Seeing loved ones that are going through this, right? What can we do to kind of take care of ourselves so it doesn't take over, right? Our life or our thinking or everything. What can we do?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is so important, because a situation like this can just feel like it's exhausting and draining, and can take everything out of you if you are being so concerned for somebody that you care about, and you feel so powerless and helpless to really do anything to make meaningful change. So first of all, it's really important to acknowledge your emotions and your distress to yourself about the situation. And probably the victim or survivor is not the person that you need to process that with, because they've got enough on their plate. They don't need to be worried about how you're affected too. And so seek your own support, perhaps from a counselor, or perhaps from the National Domestic Violence Hotline. It's free. It's available 24/7, and you can talk to them via phone, via chat, or via text. And that hotline is so important, and it's not just for the people who are being abused. They get a whole lot of calls from people who are calling because they're concerned about a family member or a friend, and they want advice on, how do I handle this? What do I do to help?
Right. Yeah.
Develop your own coping strategies. That may be doing some deep breathing. It may be doing some journaling. It may be engaging in various other self-care. But just kind of remembering that you still have your life to lead too, and not let yourself become completely subsumed by this situation.
Mm-hmm.
If you become drained, that old saying of you can't pour from an empty cup,
Right.
So if you become totally drained, then you don't have anything left either for the person that you're concerned about, or
Mhm.
for yourself, or for your own family that you may have, or your job. You can read about domestic violence, become educated, listen to podcasts. You can just learn more about domestic violence. And, there's a lot out there about what it is and how you can help. To combat feelings of helplessness, you can do some active things, such as becoming active in social justice around domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
In Texas, the Texas Council on Family Violence does a lot of policy work, and they're a nonprofit agency that um, does a lot of things. They hold like marches at the Capitol, and they do a lot of policy work that people can get involved in. They do their Purple Postcard campaign, where you can get people to sign pledges for, you know, um, standing up against domestic violence and things like that. And so becoming an awareness, oh, active in awareness or policy campaigns can really help combat that sense of helplessness that we feel. So can doing something to help a local domestic violence organization. Maybe you want to volunteer at the organization, or you want to donate to their thrift store so that they can earn money to keep helping people who are impacted. These are all ways that we can take care of ourselves. And finally, recognize that the ultimate decision is up to the person. You can offer all the help you can, all the support that you can, and you haven't failed if they don't follow up on that. If they don't do what you think they should, they haven't failed and you haven't failed.
Yeah, I think that last part is really really important, of this idea. I think going back to it, right, like of saving or fixing, right, is if you don't like remove this person immediately or get them out of this relationship, you failed them, right? You're not enough, or like you didn't do enough, and it's you are not responsible, right? Or even have like the power to make someone choose different, right? And
Right.
it's a hard thing to grapple with, but also like it's the reality of it. Like you're not that person in that relationship, and you can do only so much and hold the other person accountable and responsible for, like removing themselves or X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to transition a little bit, to like zoom out even more, or how does community and culture play a role in how people respond to abuse? Meaning, like we've been talking about, how does an outsider respond to this? But even more like zooming out, how should or what could be helpful for our community or culture to respond to abuse?
Exactly. Yeah, it's so important because these aren't just personal issues, they're societal issues, and so many different structures in society play a role. And some communities, whether it's racial communities or faith communities, religious communities, some will give different messages, such as ending a marriage is sinful, or ending a marriage brings shame to the family or stigma to our community. And so what we need is for those communities to be becoming more educated and changing the way that they address domestic violence. We need, like in faith communities, for it to be spoken from the pulpit, that domestic violence is wrong and not acceptable, is not welcome in our parishioners, that people who report being abused will be supported and helped, and that you're not expected to stay in a marriage if you're being abused and it's not your fault, you shouldn't take on like, well, if you would just make him happy, then he wouldn't do that to you.
That's reminded me of a recent documentary. I can't remember the name of it, but it was about like the Eastern Orthodox Jewish community when the wives do like speak up about their abuse, or they like talk to about it with a quote unquote safe person, then they get reprimanded for saying anything about it, or to seek help, or even like leaving, or like planning to leave. Right.
Wow. And then something else that can happen is particularly within some communities where they already feel like their community is stigmatized just for existing, such as sometimes the LGBTQ community. There can be within the community a sort of a pact sort of within the community of silence, of we don't want to admit that our relationships can include violence also. We don't want to admit that domestic violence happens in our relationships. And so people are not encouraged to come forward with that information or to leave an unhealthy relationship.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Cyndi, to bring up, of the kind of idea of maybe relationships that aren't as societally like accepted, right? I'm thinking, of course, like LGBT, but also interracial, right? Because that's still something that there's a lot of grossness about, and people's ideas of you can't be in an interracial relationship. But it just makes me think of too of, you're right, like it adds this extra layer of, we almost have to prove, right, consistently that, you know, this relationship is just as valid as the heteronormative, right? And so when things like this exist, as they do in any relationship, no matter who's involved in it or how many partners are involved in it, right? Like, it's like this idea of, we can't admit that because that would just affirm for others out there who think that we shouldn't be together or it's wrong. It kind of just affirms that narrative. And then it's so damaging because then people don't come forward, right? And like, so it just like, I think that's something that's not talked about enough, is just how impactful things like this are. Then, you know, even I think you could tie that to like, if you grew up or in a really religious like environment or culture, and the idea of, if you're married, right? And like you do whatever to be obedient to your husband, and you take whatever that looks like it has an impact, and it changes the way people will talk about it or even admit that this is what's going on.
Exactly. Yes. And sometimes in communities of color, there are, also situations where there are, norms that you stay together, or I've heard from many clients who have talked about it, like there's the idea of, the Black man is so stigmatized in society and everything's so hard for him in society. Everybody else is so hard on him that when he comes home, he needs to be like king of the castle, and everything needs to be, made easy for him. And you don't, stand up to him or challenge him in any way. And obviously that's not going to be the case in every relationship of color. That is something that clients of color have shared with me sometimes, that they've experienced that expectation.
Right. Yeah. And I've even heard a lot too, like an interracial, right? If it's an African American man with a white woman, of that expectation of, because it's a white woman, right, of being more subservient, right, because of the kind of like heteronormative of what they've seen. And like that shows up, right? Like it shows up of this like abuse model, no matter what you look like or who you are, who you love.
Exactly. And I've had women, African American or Black clients who have told me that they were afraid of being perceived as the quote angry Black woman. That there's such a stereotype about that, and they were afraid of being perceived that way, and so they did not speak up.
Right. Yeah. Another sequel.
Yeah. So there are so many layers, as you say, layers upon layers upon layers. And then, of course, we have stereotypes of certain professions, such as sometimes people believe that people in certain professions, because their work is so hard or so traumatizing or whatever, that they kind of get a pass because they just, they are just so stressed out or so, traumatized by their work that, well, it's understandable that he comes home and he feels that way, or he does those things. He's got to let it out somehow, someplace. And of course, that's not true because, even people in those professions don't have to be abusive, and many of them aren't. And it's not acceptable, no matter who you are or what you do or what color your skin is or your sexual orientation or any of that, your identity. It's never okay for abuse to happen.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have unhealthy media portrayals of love and sacrificing everything for the relationship, the movies, the TV shows, all the things where that is portrayed as, isn't that romantic? I want somebody who will want me so bad that they'll chase me. They won't give up. They'll pursue me.
Right.
And no, I don't want to be stalked, but it is romanticized.
Right. Yes. It makes me think of well, at least for me, I don't know, this is how you feel, Ash, but of growing up, the Disney princesses and all the stories were just like, oh, it's so beautiful, I wanted to be that. And now as an adult, I'm like, what in the world? Like everything has this like underlying story, right? Of like, this is not okay, this is not healthy, but it's so romanticized, it's so fantasized, and it's like we're marketing that to younger children and then wondering why that, like we're tolerating or almost expecting this in relationships. But again, another sequel, another time.
Right.
But I guess too, as we're wrapping this up, of what for you, Cyndi, obviously we've covered a lot of different areas here, a lot of great information. What would you say would be the biggest takeaway you would want someone that's listening to this podcast right now to walk away from and remember above maybe even anything else that we talked about today?
I think that really the most important thing, if you remember nothing else, the most important takeaway would be just continue to let that person know that you are there for them no matter what. Your support is not conditional. You care for them no matter what decision they make, no matter what the outcome is, that you are a safe person and you will be there for them and they can come back to you.
Oh, that is so powerful.
Yes. Original Cyndi Grady quotes at the end of this podcast episode.
Yes.
Well, thank you again, Cyndi, for joining us today. As always, you give such great information and just so insightful of things, especially this topic that I don't feel like is talked about enough, is still too taboo in our world. And I appreciate your transparency and saying it as it is, right? Because I think we need to have more of that. So yeah, thank you for tuning in again with us, and can't wait for more sequels.
Well, thank you so much. I was so glad to be here today, and I feel energized and excited, and I'm also looking forward to more sequels. Thanks again.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Cyndi. Like the way that you speak on this topic and just in general, like it's very like personable and like relatable, and you make it the conversation not scary to have. And I think that's kind of like a vibe that's around domestic violence or even just like abuse in general. It's like it's scary to talk about, and you make it really not scary to talk about. And I'm so appreciative of you coming and talking with us. And
well, that's really meaningful to me to hear that. That touches me very much. Thank you so much for that feedback, Ashley. And thank you once again, both of you, for having me today.
Yeah.
Yes. Cool. And our wonderful, wonderful listeners. Cyndi talked about a few like resources, but we will also link these in the episode bio. So be sure to check those out. But we will see you again next month. Stay tuned for another episode, which is the topic
of navigating difficult parental relationships as a child. Child. So like similar to this, like we're coming from the viewpoint of the child and navigating those difficult parental relationships.
Oh, gross. I'm gonna prepare myself now. Prepare yourself, listeners. But thank you, and we will see you next month. Bye.
Bye.